Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to talk about the art and science of naming a product or company, the dreaded naming experience.
Yeah, we may have a little problem there.
Peter Gregory's check.
So it's made out to Pied Piper Incorporated. I checked with the Secretary of State website, and there's already a Pied Piper operating in California. So we need to change our name.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah, praise the Dark Lord. That's great news.
No, it's not great news. We love the name Pied Piper. It's a classic fairy tale.
Well, I looked it up. It's about a predatory flautist who murders children in a cave.
It has all that going for it, Richard, and I still hate it.
Richard, if we are going to change the name, we need to do it now. Names stick. My name's only Jared because Gavin called me that on my first day. My real name is Donald.
But Jared, we already bought the t-shirts. I can't take these back. It was an online order.
What is that atrocity? What are we, an Irish pornography company? I thought we were going to replace the name Pied Piper. I thought it was just a placeholder.
Placeholder would honestly be a better name than Pied Piper.
Richard, I've actually been holding off telling people that I'm the co-founder of Pied Piper because, frankly, it's a little embarrassing.
All right, so that is a clip from the HBO show Silicon Valley, and it was all about naming and what it takes to name your company. Demetrius, good morning. Are you ready to talk about the art and science of naming?
I am. And the reason why I am is because I don't actually have to name anything.
I know. Well, no, that's not true. That's not true. We had to name our company and we had to name the products, or we tried to name the products that we invented and licensed.
Yeah, that's sunk cost. That's already been done. And I think in general, we come up with some good names. I was thinking about the name The X, which I think if you're not working in tech, you're probably, well, what's the deal with the X? But if you are in tech, especially if you're in UX or product design or anything like that, then it's going to resonate with you. So I think for that audience, the name is pretty good. But outside of that audience, I wonder if maybe we could have gotten something better.
Yeah, I mean, we spent months trying to figure out the name. I mean, the fact is we could have recorded 5 episodes and still not come up with a name. I mean, it was a very challenging thing. Matter of fact, you and I had to talk to lawyers to figure out if we can even purchase the X based on the fact that somebody used it for something years ago and then abandoned it. It was kind of a complicated process considering that we don't get paid to do this, but we had to pay lawyers in order to figure out if we could do it.
I feel like naming is the thing that people will tend to come to us the most, just to be like, oh, hey, how do you guys handle naming? Because it is such a painful process. And the worst part is when you come up with the perfect name, everybody loves it, but you can't use it because it's taken.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So the questions that I usually get are, how do tech companies come up with their names? What is the process for doing it? How does it work? Can it be done better? Why does everybody struggle with it, even big tech companies? Today, we're going to get into this. And I think a big part of this is really understanding what we kind of said at the beginning, the art and science of naming. It is not a pure scientific process. If you make it a pure scientific process, it just doesn't seem to work. If you make it a pure artistic process, like you said, it doesn't seem to work. Legal hits you or someone else gets you from another angle because it doesn't, connect with someone in a foreign country or whatever it is. So let's talk about it and really dig in, because I think this is an important topic for a lot of people who are starting their companies or building a product right now and trying to figure out what they're going to do. Now, I tend to cringe a little when a client says to me, D, hey, do you think you guys can help us out with coming up with a name? And the reason why I cringe is we tend to pull user data as a way of kind of helping us make decisions with clients. And in this particular case, we haven't found a lot of success with users helping us come up with names, right?
Yeah. So there's an expectation when people come to us, I'm like, oh, just go to the users, ask them, here's what the company or the product is, what would be a good name for it, and the users will come up with a name. That tends not to happen. And the reason why that tends not to happen is because, number one, naming is very hard. And users aren't usually thinking as deeply about it as they need to in order to come up with something like a name. It's like a name becomes like a whole identity. So it's a difficult thing. And then if any names they do come up with, they're not going through the whole check of the checks that we're talking about, including the legal, or if there's any kind of unintended alternative names or interpretations of the name, like if there's
Yep.
innuendo built into it or anything. You can get lucky. This has happened before where somebody, you're doing something and somebody just says like, why don't you just call it this? And you're like, oh my God, that's a great name.
I don't even know how that happens though. See, that's the thing is like clients
It's
always
just
ask
pure
us.
luck. It's pure luck.
Yeah, they'll just like drop a name and you're like, "Oh, how come we never thought of that?" And
Yeah.
it's like it comes from this non-scientific approach which makes you and I go, "Ugh," like we couldn't figure out a way to formally generate this name.
No, it feels like it's just inspiration. And sometimes someone somewhere, whether it's somebody in the company, outside of the company, somebody who's a user, or just a random person on the street will just come up with like, oh, you should call it this. I'm like, oh my God, that's a great name.
Well, you know,
Uh,
I'll tell you a funny story, D. We recently got a cat, as you know, and his name is
mhm,
Cosmo. We call him Cosmo the space cat. And
mhm,
the reason is because he's dark blue gray, and then he has these piercing yellow eyes. And when he stares at you, those yellow eyes almost look like the cosmos. It's like you can almost see like the universe in his eyes. It's really cool.
mhm.
Or shooting lasers at you, something like that. And so the funny thing is that how we came up with that name was my wife came up with it. She was just like, what about Cosmos? After we went through this rigorous process. And part of that rigorous process was I actually used ChatGPT to generate names. And I said, keep generating names, keep generating names. And they weren't good. To be honest
Yeah,
with you, they were kind of lame.
yeah.
And so I was like, okay, this
You
isn't
mean
working.
ChatGPT generated something lame?
Yeah. So we I realized that maybe the way in which I was searching, like I should have been more complex. Like we had this conversation, just as a quick side note. My wife and I had this quick conversation about how younger people will write a full paragraph of what they want on ChatGPT, but people who are born with traditional search, like the way that our mind
Mhm.
is associates with categorization, we go in and we say, write me a name that has these parameters, X, Y, and Z. And younger people will drop like 20 parameters in there and maybe they're getting better results. But like when I dropped in like 3 parameters and said, come up with these names, it just couldn't come up with a name that I thought was compelling.
Mhm.
But even that was hard. And I think with this podcast, I think one of the things we got to start with before we tell everyone about our process for coming up with a name and some things that we think will be helpful for them is to talk about the things that we've named and what happened and the stories kind of associated with them. So, what do you think about starting off with our company name? Okay, so
Okay.
you came up with the name Metric Lab. That was
Mhm.
completely you out of the blue. We were originally called ActiveComm Labs. And the reason why we were called ActiveComm Labs is because Demetrius and I started our careers focusing on communication. And so we were doing so much research in this area and doing really neat stuff. And that stuff kind of worked its way into building the company that we thought like active communication labs. Like we're actively communicating and it's a lab, like we're doing research. And it doesn't really click with the variety of research we do. And we tried and tried and tried to come up with other names. And then one day you just said, what about Metric Lab? So why don't you tell everyone where that came from?
All right. So that rebranding happened in 2008, and that's relevant because it was right when the economy was crashing. So we were kind of in, we were rebranding to some extent because we felt like we needed to. We were, a lot of our clients had moratoriums on vendors and stuff. So we're like, all right, let's take this moment to rebrand. Let's kind of reframe ourselves and put ourselves in a better position to be working with these clients. So during that time, there was a song that was out. It was called Help I'm Alive by a band called Metric. And
Hmm.
I loved this song and I felt like it spoke to our experience at that point in time in which we were like struggling to keep the company alive. We were like going broke and all these kinds of things. And I really loved the song. And I thought the band name was great. But it almost felt as though that band name was more appropriate for us because we deal with metrics all day long, right? That's when you're doing research, you're always generating metrics, you're coming up with new metrics. And I love the name lab because lab indicated research, metrics
Mm-hmm.
and lab indicates research. And then when you say metric lab, it sounds like you're experimenting with new forms of metrics, which is kind of exactly what we were doing, especially at that point in time in which this profession was still very new. Everything was still getting kind of hashed out. There was a lot of methodologies that exist now that didn't exist back then, that some of which we had a hand in developing. So I thought it ended up being a really good name for us, and people tend to remember it. The only thing that people tend not to remember is whether it's lab or labs, and that doesn't seem that important at the end of the day.
No,
So
we lost the narrative on metric though, because so many people call it metrics lab.
that too,
And
yeah.
I'm like, where did that come from? Like, it's pretty clear, metric lab, but everyone goes metrics lab, and I think it just maybe flows a little bit better. I mean, that's a perfect example of losing the narrative on it, because we were like, it sounds clean, metric lab, and then everyone says
Yeah.
metrics lab, including our biggest clients.
Well, everybody's going to mess up your name. Even Google gets called like the Google or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it happens.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's a really cool story, because see, that didn't come from anything formalized or scientific. Now, I love that the way that the name connects, right? So it's like
Mhm.
measurement, lab, experimentation. That's what we do, right? That made more sense. Now, I don't know if you recall, but like during that time, we also thought about changing the name because we reached out to an old designer friend of ours who was just amazing at her job when she lived in the Bay Area, and she moved to Italy. And
Mhm.
she was so kind to get on a call in 2008. I said, hey, look, we have no clients, we have no money. Basically, the economy has crashed. What do we do? And she was like, look, I don't like your name that much because it's too long. Also, she said, you guys are amazing at what you do. So you have to rebrand and let everybody understand or see what you do for a living. And she said, when times are kind of spinning down, that's the time that you use to rebrand and clean things up. And that was
Yep.
kind of an inspiration to looking at the name as well, which was, okay, we've been doing this for 3 years. Most of them were government contracts. They were not like big tech contracts other than eBay. And it's time for us to refresh and look awesome to our customers.
Mhm.
The other thing was we invented a product in, I have to like look at my thing over here now. 2011.
Oh wow, that was a long time ago now.
Yeah. So, well, the reason why I say 2011 because you and I invented it in 2011, but it actually I think was in the market in 2014.
Okay.
But in 2000, well, no, actually, I'm wrong, D. It was 2009 when we actually invented it, and then it
Mhm.
came to market in 2011.
Wow.
So yeah, a long time ago. Time has flown by. So we invented a product based on the release of the iPhone, and this was a mount that would attach to the back of the airline seat, so you can snap your phone in and you can watch movies and all that stuff. And the reason why we thought this was cool was because suddenly nobody was looking at those huge old archaic screens that are on airplanes. They were
Mhm.
planning on removing them because of the weight. And we thought, well, now you can put movies with iTunes on your iPhones. So why don't we create a mount that attaches to that little lever on the back of the tray table on the airplane,
Mhm.
and then snap your phone in there? So Demetrius and I and our other team, Anthony and Ray and stuff, we secured a patent on the product itself. We invented it and we created it with the whole goal of licensing it to a company that could basically sell the product, get it into the market, which we did. So we licensed it to Griffin Technology and they started selling it in the market. Now, the naming part of this. We were trying to generate names, and I don't even recall, D, who came up with this name. It might have been Anthony, it might have been you, but we called it the Jet Set. And
Yes.
we're like, yes, we're jet setting. Like you have your phone and you're a jet setter and you're traveling the world and you're watching movies. And we named it that during our big pitch with Griffin's CEO. And he loved it too. He's like, oh, this is cool. This is interesting. By the time it got to the licensing, the deal signed, all that kind of good stuff, it gets to their marketing department, and the marketing department completely scrapped that name and didn't like it. And they called it the Skyview, which I thought was even better. And so I was like, now, how come we didn't think of that? You're in the sky and you're viewing something. And they had to secure that name and trademark it and get it all locked in and stuff. What did you think about that process and how those names were created when we were doing that?
I think that worked out. I'm going to disagree with you. I like Jet Set better. I
Really?
feel like Skyview sounds more generic and doesn't roll off the tongue quite as much. It sounds like you're staring out of a window or something. Like a jet setter is like this cool person who's traveling the world and doing cool fun stuff. Like I think it's more evocative of something fun and interesting.
Yeah.
Where Skyview just sounds like, okay, here's a weather balloon, right? So I still think it's a good name. It's short enough. It evokes like, hey, you're in the sky and you're viewing something, so that's pretty cool. But I thought Jet Set had like more of a cool, fun, hip connotation, and it's like 2 syllables, flows right off of your tongue. Like it's a common term. They never really told us why they changed it. Maybe they thought Skyview was better. As far as maybe it communicates what the product does a little bit better. So
Yeah.
that's in the end, I thought it was still a good name. I just
Yeah.
really like Jet Set, and I know that I came up with that. I remember that. I don't know where it came from. I think it's one of those things where I was like, we were struggling for a name and stuff, and I probably went out for a walk and was like, oh, Jet Set. Oh, that's a good name.
Interestingly, and this is not a diss on you in any way, but like you have traditionally been the kind of more quant person of our relationship, where you focus on like a lot of the very detailed data analyses, where I'm a little more on the qualitative side and basically on running the business side. And what's interesting is that you've come up with every name I think in this company. Every name for the company name, the podcast name, the Skyview name, Jet Set name. Like, it's weird how your brain works because it's such a creative thing, but yet you do tend to have high competency and tend to enjoy a lot of the quant mathematical side of things.
Well, I also do a lot of the actual like writing, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of the docs and stuff. I'm the one who actually sits down and puts words to paper,
Yeah.
metaphorically speaking. So I guess that comes up. Like I have to think a lot about how to like get those words in place in order to convey something, because
Yeah.
I don't want to get too deep into like the nuts and bolts of like technical writing for research findings and stuff. But a lot of times you are in a position where like, all right, how do I frame this research finding up so that people will internalize what the data is communicating? Because it happens all the time that somebody will come to us and be like, oh, here's our data set and here's what we're thinking. And I look at him like, I wouldn't draw that from this data, and here's the reason why, and here's what
Yeah.
I would think of instead. So that's one of the ways in which data can go wrong, or data analysis can go wrong, is the interpretation of what it means. So I think communicating that usually means that you have to figure out words around like, here's what the data is and here's what we think it means and here's the reason why. So
Yeah.
that's all words for the most part.
Yeah, no, it's true. But I think there's a lesson to be learned here, which is that a lot of times the names are basically the naming is given off to the creative team only,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think that necessarily says that that's where the best name's going to come from. If
No.
you looked at the whole company, it's almost better to like survey the whole company and let them drop in names and ideas and things like that, and then try to derive something effective from that, because you never know who's going to come up with such a cool name that might work. Now, the one thing I will say is the name got changed again, because about 3-4 years later, Griffin Technology, maybe it was 3 or 4 years later, they sold their company. And so we ended our licensing agreement with them. I don't know if that was like natural. I think it was coming to an end or something like that. And then we relicensed it to another company based out of Minnesota, and they'd started reselling the product, rebuilt it in a kind of a little bit of a new way to work better for their customers. And they called it the Road Tripper. And I thought that was an interesting take on it. Initially, I wasn't too fond of it as much. I like road trips, but it felt a little more like it's connected with the car rather than connected with the airplane, even though they adapted it to kind of work in more situations than just the airplane. But then later I realized that a lot of people remembered the name Road Tripper, but couldn't remember the name Skyview as much. So I
Yeah.
have no idea what happened there. But what did you think of the name Road Tripper and when they changed it?
So I was okay with it. It was with Brackatron. So if
Yeah.
you're interested in this product, it's still on Amazon. I just looked it up.
Yeah.
You can still buy it today. It's the Brackatron Road Tripper. So the reason why, and it's the airplane travel mount. So the reason why they changed the name is because they already had the Brackatron, or they already had the Road Tripper name associated with their line of car mounts.
Uh-huh.
I didn't like it as well for the airplane mount, for the Jet Set or the Skyview, because it does evoke being in the car.
Yeah.
Now, we worked with them, and it got redesigned so that it was also more usable in the car. And actually, I think they had a better industrial design and overall design of the product. But I didn't feel like the name was quite as strong. It feels a little bit. It's a little bit longer. It sounds like you're using it in a car or at a bus or something, and it's just a little bit more mundane because of that, right? Like a road trip versus like jetting around the world is a little bit more like earthbound.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I would agree with the industrial design as well. They did an amazing job with the industrial
mhm.
design. I mean, I still use mine as of today.
Yeah.
So it works really, really well. The next product is we actually were, it was a different relationship. We were actually hired by Griffin to kind of innovate a new product for people with disabilities and like specifically ones with their hands and stuff. And this was during a time when iPads were becoming increasingly popular. And we worked out a kind of a licensing agreement, the whole entire thing with them at the time. And we created this stylus. And Demetrius and I kept kind of like recreating these new ways to hold it so it was more comfortable and that kind of stuff, so that you can use the stylus on your iPad or similar device, and it wouldn't hurt your hand by gripping it, because people with arthritis and stuff like that, they struggle with the gripping and squeezing of things. And so we created this thing called the Ergo Grip. And ultimately, the Ergo Grip, which not necessarily the best name probably for the stylus, got changed to the Wave Grip Stylus. And I think it's because the stylus itself is extremely unique in the way it looks, and it looks like almost like a wave flowing through it. But when you put your hands on it, it looks weird. And then when you put your hands on it, you go, oh, this is really comfortable. And it works really well. And actually, the reviews have been phenomenal on it. But the name, I don't know. I was, I told them, I was like, I'm like 50-50 on the name, but you guys can do whatever you want. Because, I mean, they have the right to do that.
So to be clear on this one, I remember us calling it the Ergo Stylus, and we did not bother with, because it wasn't developed for us. We weren't taking it to market. We were developing this under contract. We didn't bother to come up with like, all right, well, this is going to be a finalized name that's going to go to market. This was kind of like an internal code name, right? Uh, so it's. I actually kind of thought Ergo Stylus or Ergo Grip was a better name. Wave Grip sounds like you're trying to like grab the ocean or something. It's fine in the end of the day, at the end of the day, because it does kind of have this wave shape to it. But they came up with that, we didn't. And yeah, I can't complain too much because I didn't really want to go through the whole like painful process of figuring out a name for it, because I imagine Ergo Stylus and Wave and Ergo Grip Stylus. I mean, the word stylist to start off is just this awkward name to say.
Yeah.
So you're kind of behind the eight ball to begin with. That's one of the things where Apple would like just say like, we're not using the word stylus, just like they don't use AI. We're using what do they call it, like a spatial grip or something like that.
Yeah.
So they can use something else. Or they use, what do they call it? There's the E Pen or I forget, the Apple Pen or something like that. But they'll ditch that stylus word and to go to something else. It's probably a good idea.
Well,
But yeah,
I'm sure they struggled with it as well, right? At least with
yeah.
Apple, to be honest, like they have a very kind of like structured flow. Like, it's like the iPad, the iPhone, like they can kind of like fall into their category.
Consistent branding, and it's made it easy. Like I was debating talking about like, I don't love the name iPhone.
Yeah.
Because it's just fun. You put an I on it. It's not doesn't differentiate. It's to me it's not a great name. But iPod was a great name, and they just kind of kept it.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, I would basically say that of all the things we're going to talk about today, we'll talk about our process for coming up with names and working with clients and things like that. I don't think anyone is ever consistently happy. Like that's one thing I definitely will say. Like we will always have opinions of what we like and don't like. And I kind of think it comes down to value. If you value something really, really highly and it's amazing, you'll kind of tolerate it if it's got a terrible name, and you'll forget about it if the name is decent.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll explain that a little more as we move along here. So let's talk about how we and clients and others in Silicon Valley come up with names because we've been part of the naming process for like 20 years. And every time someone asks us to do it, I get this like tension in my shoulders and I grit my teeth for a moment and then I go down the steps and I go through the whole process with them. And I love the process. It just makes me cringe a little because it's so hard because no one's ever really happy.
Yeah.
So why don't you get started and kick us off with, how the first couple things that you consider?
Yeah, so I feel like we gotta kind of preface this a little bit by saying like this isn't like it's not like doing math or riding a bike or something. It's not like you put the work in and then you get and when the work is done, you'll get a good finished thing out. You'll do the work and you might find that like, okay, I'm still not happy with it. So I got to go back to the drawing board. And maybe you'll find that this process that we outlined doesn't work for you and you have a different process. And what at the end of the day, it is whatever works for you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also other things like we talked, like Bryan said, surveying the whole company. It could be just its own kind of channel on Slack for every single person on the company to weigh in and come up with ideas. Because at the end of the day, the more people that are contributing ideas, the easier that it becomes. So that said, I'm going to establish a bit of an outline for a process, and this is ultimately kind of what has worked for us. And maybe somebody out there has something better. But the first thing we do is we talk with between ourselves and with whoever we're working with, whether it's client or partner or whatever it happens to be, to establish a feel and kind of what should the name feel like. Should it be fun or should it be serious? Should it be wholesome or should it be spicy? Should it be young or should it be mature? Like what are we kind of overall looking for as far as like what kind of feeling it should evoke?
How would you define Initech?
So this is where so I hear Initech, you know what I think of?
What?
Microsoft.
Yeah, 100%. Well,
Yeah.
if you think about it, when Microsoft came out, so I think that culturally we actually go through these time periods, right, where everybody copies everybody, right? And Initech, the joke from the movie Office Space, is kind of around the time when Microsoft was like, the only talk of town, right?
Yeah.
And it's very much, I would call it mature and serious, nothing fun.
It's very technical and nerdy.
Yeah, technical
Right.
and nerdy, yeah.
So you hear Initech and I mean, it's from Office Space. So you think of like cubicles and like enterprise software and stuff like that, which is like, if you were to compare, right, you have the two founding fathers of home computing, right? You have Apple and you have Microsoft, and they both have pluses and negatives. People will say Apple's a great name, and in some ways it's a good name, but it's not a great name. The reason why it became a great name is because Apple spent so much money on marketing in order to make it become like a household name, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, look at the reason why he picked the name. So it showed up in the beginning of the Yellow Pages.
Yeah, I mean that's like, for quadruple A like collision repair, right? So
Yep.
like back in the 80s, people heard when it was first coming out, and we were kids at the time. So, and you saw this in the Forrest Gump movie, right? Where it's like people heard the name Apple and they thought, oh, it's a fruit company, right? So they're selling fruit on the side of the road or in the grocery stores and stuff. On the other side of things, you had Microsoft, which made you think of a tech company, but in the most boring way you could possibly come up with something. So those two things, they have different feels. Apple, I think, has a better feel. Microsoft has a very boring feel, but it does a better job of communicating with the company.
Well, here's a great example too. Around the time, not at the exact time, but around the time when Microsoft was coming out and all that stuff, is when Logitech came out. And Logitech is a household name for a lot of people. They produce the mice that are out there. I think they actually produce the mice for Microsoft and other brands. They white label and that kind of stuff. They actually tried to change their name about 5 years ago, called Logi. They
Yeah.
wanted to be more relevant, and it didn't really work. They changed it
Yep.
back. I believe they changed it back. And the reason why it didn't work was because it's just known as Logitech. So it's like weird to be like, oh, now I'm going to take, like, for example, if we called Microsoft like Micro, everyone would be like, what?
Yeah.
Right? It just
Well,
didn't feel right.
It's because Logitech well, to be fair, also back in the early '80s, tech was cool and it was hip and it was exciting and stuff like that. Now the term is much more associated with like the term tech is much more associated, I think, with like offices and cubicles and enterprise software and stuff like that. So it makes sense that in you get into the '90s and 2000, that stuff is much less sexy. So it's like, all right, well, let's drop the tech because that's the part that's creating that feel, that kind of icky like office work feel. Just go with Logi. The problem is Logi by itself isn't a great name either because it sounds weird. Logitech is a portmanteau, I think, of logical tech.
Yep.
So when you put that together, portmanteaus are really popular. And I'm looking into why you should be careful with those. But like when you put them together, okay, you have something new, and it implies you're doing something very logical around tech, which again feels kind of boring, right? And if you're getting into the gaming space and fun stuff like Logitech has, then you kind of want to think about what else you can do with the brand. And they come up with, I think it's G for gaming is their brand of mice and controllers for that.
Absolutely, yeah. And so it's complicated. So even the biggest companies can make mistakes, and that's
Oh
something
yeah.
to point out. Especially the reason why that example is so relevant, and probably business schools have talked about this example, right? So
Mm-hmm.
after you establish a feel, the next thing you do is you brainstorm a bunch of ideas, right? I mean, you just
Yep.
start getting them on the whiteboard. I mean, literally, we put them on the whiteboard. Like even put them in a file doesn't work sometimes as
Yeah.
well
Or
as
or even
writing them.
the old post-it note thing. Sometimes we would do that.
Yeah, Post-it notes all over the place. I mean, talk a little bit just for a second as a side note, D, about the podcast name, The X, right?
Yeah, so we wanted something that sounded good, was short, and kind of was evocative, and we were specifically targeting people within the industry. I think we're a little bit more now tend to appeal probably more to people outside of the industry who are interested in how things work in Silicon Valley. But that was kind of our thought at the time. So we would come up with a bunch of ideas, and then we kept coming back to the X. And I think one of the big things about it was the simplicity. And at the time, we were actually thinking about the logo, right? Because it was going to be a piece of media. So we wanted something that was going to have a strong logo and strong visuals. And an X does a great job with that. It has, the X marks the spot and those kinds of connotations to it. Like, oh, you found what you're looking for.
Yeah,
So
and
that
we
was
we
some
went
of the things we
through a lot of names. I mean, that brainstorming took weeks, and after we brainstormed those ideas, we went down to the next section here, which is basically identifying what you hate about those ideas.
Yeah, so that's one of the most important things. So you go through and you find out like, all right, we're gonna brainstorm, and usually brainstorming means all right, we're gonna throw the kitchen sink at it. No bad ideas at that point. This is where we start identifying. You know which ones are already the bad ideas, but what you need to go a little step further is why are they bad ideas, right? So that one has the wrong feel. That one's too long. That one is has some kind of innuendo to it. Those are all the things, and you start identifying which of the other ones are, and then you start to narrow in on like, okay, these ones, this class over here is the ones we like. That's also part of it, but also why you like it, and identifying all the reasons why you hate some names and why you like some other names is what is going to help you get to the next step.
Yeah, and that next step is basically getting away and letting it marinate. I would say this is probably the number one thing. Like
Yeah,
like,
this is the most
there's
important thing.
no doubt in my mind that people don't do this. They grind and grind and grind. Naming is not something that you could just keep working on all night long and suddenly come up with a name. Like, you have to
Yeah.
walk away from it.
In fact, I think that the longer you grind at it, the worse it gets and the worse it becomes. Because if you'll notice this, if you're going to the brainstorm a bunch of ideas, you're gonna hit a sweet spot where you get good ideas. If you go past that, you're just gonna generate ideas that you hate, like everybody hates, and you'll step away from 10 minutes and look back at it and be like, "What was I thinking? I was just getting
Yeah.
desperate because I was trying to make this end."
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to some comedy writers talk about writing for, sitcom shows, and one thing
Hmm.
they were saying is they write a lot of bad ideas on purpose.
Hmm.
So that whole idea of, like, brainstorming isn't just like, "Oh, what is the best one I have in my head?" But, like, getting some of the bad stuff out and putting it on a side of the board so you understand what you don't want in addition to what maybe you do want, and then sometimes the bad idea could lead to the good idea during that marination time. because
Yeah. So
you're walking away from it and suddenly it starts
yeah.
marinating.
Yeah, the way I think about it is when you're doing all your brain dumping to start, and then you're identifying what you like and you don't like. It's almost like you're training your subconscious, like you're negotiating with your subconscious. I'm like, all right, back of my brain, this is what I need. Get to work. I'm going to give you space. We're going to go for a walk. I'm going to, sit in a hot tub. I'm going to go fly a kite. Whatever it is, to get my mind, my conscious mind off of it, my ego off of that, and let my subconscious work. And then it just sometimes it'll just speak to you. Sometimes you'll be in the shower and just be like, "Oh, hey, what about this?" And you're
Well,
like, that's not a bad name.
I would say the shower is like the best spot, the hot tub and the shower. And I was talking to somebody about why it is so many great ideas come from the shower. And they were like, what else can you do? You're like
Yeah,
stuck in this room, hot water's, blowing on you, cold water, whatever you want. And you can't really do anything else. Your brain is basically forced to relax. And the second it relaxes, suddenly it starts to solve some of the problems you've been trying to resolve. And
yeah.
so, I mean, so many great ideas have come from the shower. So take more showers.
Yeah. So at this point, what you can do is you come back together with whoever you're working with, and you get together a new list of contenders. So you do a new brain dump. This one, where the first one was like, all right, we're trying to figure out, separate the wheat from the chaff and establish criteria for what's good and what's bad. Now we're back together, and hopefully everybody comes up with a couple, and you can take a look at them and say, okay, these are all much better than the first round. Or maybe you got lucky in the first round, you found something that really works. But at this point, you're like, okay, now I'm going to get a list of real contenders together. So these are the ones who are like have actual possibilities. And that's where you feel pretty good about yourself, and you're about to feel much worse. Because what you're going to do from that point is you're going to get online and you're going to start checking the availability of each of those. Right? So you're going to feel like you have one. Like, oh, here's my favorite. And then you go online and you check, okay, what is the availability of this? And you usually do this step, Brian. So why
Yeah.
don't you talk through kind of how it goes?
Yeah. So basically, you've looked at a name so many times, you almost don't like it anymore. And then you have to remind yourself, like, okay, these are the ones that we're thinking about getting. And then I go through the legal process. So you have to look online at your county to find out whether or not that name is legally available as, let's say, a business name, or is it a potential trademark name. So you can go to the Patent and Trademark Office, search for trademarks, and type in that name and see what pops up. If it's available on all those spots, after that, I check it off and I go, okay, next phase is I have to figure out if there's a domain for it, because you're going to want a website or an app name or something like that. Um, so I'll usually check there and it's not available. And because pretty much everything's been purchased since the late 90s. So
Mm-hmm.
what you end up having to do in that situation is make a big decision. Do we want to change the name? Do we want to add to the name on the website, but keep the name the same legally under the county and under the trademark office? Or do we want to try to align everything together? Now, a big company like a Meta or an Apple, they're going to do whatever it takes. And if so, that means that the website is not
Mm-hmm.
available. They're going to contact the website owner and offer them millions of dollars to walk away from it just so they can get everything cleanly aligned.
Well,
Most,
depending on what it is.
depending on what it is, right? But well, no, I've actually read articles about product names associated with companies that made huge acquisitions had to call and
Mm-hmm.
offer $1 million to some random kid who happened to
Yeah.
have that name just to get that name and align it because they like consistency, right? And so a lot of times, like for us, the X podcast is not just the X podcast, but like we have things called the X podcast show and that kind of stuff because it just wasn't available. And that's okay. And that's okay because as a small business, I don't have the ability to just go and write checks to everyone under the sun to align everything properly. If the
Mm-hmm.
podcast took off and, suddenly we were monetizing it and making millions and millions of dollars a month, then you might say, okay, let's go down that path. But as a person who's just starting out, you got to go to the county, you got to go to the trademark office, and you got to go look for your web domain.
Yeah.
If you can get lucky and align those, you grab it and you go.
Yeah. So one thing that happened for us with our company name, with Metric Lab, is that all those worked except for the URL. We couldn't get metriclab.com. So what we had for a while was metric-lab.com because Metric Lab was owned but parked.
Yes. And it was
Remember
owned
this?
for a really long time, and we didn't even grab it. Our designer, who is amazing, happened to be checking on a regular basis. And 5 years after we changed to Metric Lab, he noticed it went up for sale. He grabbed it, put it in our name, sent it to us, and then just billed us for the cost of the domain. It
Yeah.
was unbelievably kind, amazing, and awesome of him to do that. But like, I don't think I was checking regularly because we were, busy working with clients and running the business. And he was checking regularly because that was part of kind of his job, just to like take care of his clients, which is us.
Yeah. So sometimes you will see, Brian mentioned that large companies will throw money at it. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. Sometimes you'll see companies come out with terrible names, and it's not because they couldn't come up with good names. It's because those weren't available and they weren't willing to spend the money on it. Sometimes you'll hear about a name and think that's a great name, and then it'll get renamed when it goes to market. And a lot of times that's because it became unavailable for some reason. Sometimes somebody messes up and they announce the name before they secure the naming rights, and then they have to rename it because they don't want to spend the money on it. But I will say, if you are someone with the resources, let's say, for example, you are a prominent NFL football team located in the Washington, D.C. area, and you are thinking about settling for a bad name because you don't want to pay for that good name that everybody wants, just pay the money. It's not worth having a terrible name that everybody's going to make fun of, and then you have to change the name again in a couple of years. Just pay the money for the good name.
Yeah, I would agree with that definitely, because you're talking about long-term branding, right? So
Yeah.
if you have a product idea and you really believe in that product idea and you're like, this thing is going to be around for a really long time, it is worth it to get everything aligned and to feel confident and comfortable in the name that you have when you
Mm-hmm.
launch that product in the market. If you don't, you might regret it and then have to go back and change it. Let me tell you, it's not easy to go back and change names. Like, you have to
Now,
change with the county, the state, the federal government, the URL, the
with your
trademark
user
office.
base, you have to retrain your user base for a new name
You have to
and get them
retrain
used
them.
to it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that takes money. So one of the reasons why a good name is worth it is because the amount of money that a company like Amazon or Apple or Adobe had to spend in order to build their name recognition would have been a lot less if it was a name that was more intuitive to the service that they provide. Like, Apple
Yes.
had to spend a lot of money to let people know that they are not a fruit company. And
Yeah.
Amazon had to do the same thing to let the world know that they are not like an exporter from Brazil.
Yeah.
So these are all things that are going to pay off in the long run.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about what you really should consider when picking a name to get started. So this list is.
Well, one quick point before we go into that. The last step before or the second to last step, I guess, before you pick, well, the last step before you actually pick one is you got to test these names with your
Oh
users.
yeah.
And we'll
Yeah.
talk about how that actually works, but you've got to get together a group of users. You can do it through a survey. You can do it through interviews or a focus group. That dirty word. We hate doing focus groups. We don't think they work very well. Um, but you have to get some feedback with your intended user base, people who you expect to be your customers, and get what their reactions are, because sometimes they're going to hate it and you completely don't anticipate it. Or maybe they're going to love something that you thought was a weaker contender. Or maybe they're going to point out something that you should know. Or maybe they'll just come up with like, why don't you just call it this? And just say like, oh my God, that's a perfect name. We should go with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, good point. I'm going to talk about how to do that specifically down below. So I'm glad you mentioned it right now. Um, but yeah, let's talk a little bit about like things you should consider. Now, these are things that we consider. We've done this process for 20 years with lots of different clients, and including the labs we worked in at NASA, everyone coming up with, what do you want to call this? So we've kind of been through this process. And we've kind of trimmed this down so people can kind of write notes if they want to follow us or come up with their own way. So the first thing is I think it should be brief. A nice,
Yes.
simple name that is easy to say. If it's really long, I find that the word of mouth marketing, which is really big, especially in the tech community, it just falls off. Like, you can't remember what it was. You're like, what was it called? It was called like Habit on the what? Like it's just these weird names, right? It's gotta be brief, simple, and really easy to say.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen some. The thing that comes to mind for companies that are products that they can't seem to wrap their head around making it short is like I see it a lot in anime, right? So I'm going to read off a name for you.
Uh-huh.
And it's from a very popular series that does very well. So they've kind of earned the ability to have really long names and get away with it. But there's a movie from 2010 called Mobile Suit Gundam 00, the movie Awakening of the Trailblazer. That's the entire name.
Yeah. See, that's you're not going to remember that. You're going to actually what your brain is going to do is it's going to grab a little
You're going
piece
to
of it.
shorten it.
Yeah, you're
You're
going
going
to
to
shorten
shorten
it.
it.
And what does that tell you psychologically? If your brain is shortening it, why don't we just shorten it for them,
Yes.
right? Um, the next thing is it has to be memorable. Now, people might debate me on this and say, well, if your service offering is memorable, people will remember it. But then essentially it means it's kind of memorable. So when we say memorable, it's something people will remember and like. So kind of like the financial service Robinhood, right? People don't forget that. You say, well, what's the name of that financial service that got in trouble a little bit, allows people to day trade and all that? They'd be like, oh, Robinhood. Well, because it reminds them of Robin Hood, like the show, the book, the you know,
Yeah.
the tale, right? And so it's embedded in their primal brain from when they were children. And so it's easy to remember that. So those are great names. Like those really work well.
So yeah, people will leverage terms or phrases that are already kind of in the lexicon, or they'll modify it a little bit, or you'll see some portmanteaus and stuff. But they'll use something that they don't have to like start from scratch for building the name for it. And it is true that you can have a name that nobody's ever heard of, Google, for example. I mean, Google's a kind of modification of Googleplex, which nobody knew what it was unless you were deeply, deeply into math nerddom. Nobody knew what a Googleplex was, and they had to spend a lot of money and time making it memorable and kind of breaking that ground. Uh, if you went the other route and had something that was more memorable, it's going to be easier to establish your brand.
Yes, absolutely. Evocative. That's the next one. So the name reminds the listener of what the company is or what it provides. So let me give you some examples. Metric Lab, Measurement Lab, Airbnb, Air, Bed, and Breakfast, Netflix, Internet plus Flicks, Flicks meaning films, Tesla reminds you of electricity. Like these companies, ours included in there, are trying to do something that evokes emotion or reminds you of something. This is a tactic that a lot of companies use, and we think that most people should because it basically creates a good recall in the brain of what that company does and what it is when you need to bring it up.
Yes. So this is one of the things where again it'll save you money in marketing in order to establish your brand. It's something that like a company like Netflix will do well, or YouTube will do well, but that Amazon or Apple or Google are going to have to do more heavy lifting to get that name into the lexicon.
Absolutely. So the next one is easy to say. So something that flows off the tongue is best. Long names can be hard, and telling others is a nightmare, basically. So you want to avoid awkward like strings of letters or numbers, like even MSNBC, people stumble over that, or BMW 530i. Like people go, wait, which number was it? It was six. What? Like people
Yeah.
forget things like which numbers associated with the classiest or most expensive version versus the least classy or cheapest version of things. So you have to really be careful with them. um, and you need to take into consideration that when it comes across a broad set of users. So if you just test people that are locally in Silicon Valley, they may say like, oh, it's fine. But then you test users that are not in Silicon Valley or in other places of the world, and they might go like, what? I don't remember that. And what do those letters mean, right?
Yeah. So number one, they're hard to say. The W in particular, stay away from because it's especially hard to say. You could stumble over it pretty easily. That's why everybody calls BMW Beamers instead of BMW because
Yep.
it's so long. Earthworm Jim, right? That show. It's like it's it is easier to say Earthworm Jim than the abbreviation EWJ.
Yep.
So, like, stay away from the letter W as a name. It's also not really uh it's not memorable unless you spend a lot of money establishing who they are, like IBM's and BMW's, the NBC, ABC. Those are companies who came in when there was not anywhere near as much competition as there is now, and it took them a lot of effort and money in order to get them to be household names.
Yeah, there's another one that I thought was really fun that I was thinking about the other day, which is Conan O'Brien. When he started his production company, he basically his customers actually developed it. So they used to call him Coco, and everyone would call, instead of Conan O'Brien, they'd call him Coco. And
Yeah.
so when he started his production company, he called it Team Coco.
Yep, it's a
Right?
great name.
Yeah. So it all basically aligns, and it made basically his user base super happy too, because they were like, "Hey, we call you Coco, and now you called your company Team Coco.
Yeah.
Like, we love that."
So just to kind of nail the point home before I start talking just briefly about portmanteaus and why you should be careful with them, is that I have driven a Lexus for, I don't know, was it like probably like 5 years now? This particular Lexus for the past 5 years. I had a BMW before that. So I keep getting these alphanumeric names for the cars. I know that my Lexus is an IS model or in the line. No, it's a Lexus IS2, I want to say 250, but I can never remember what the numbers are. I've been driving this thing for 5 years. I can never remember the full name of the car. All I remember is Lexus IS2 something. And if somebody's really into Lexus cars, they probably know exactly what that is, and they can remember what that car name is. I've kind of grew up as a car guy, but when I was growing up, there were cars called Camaro and Corvette and Thunderbird and stuff. It wasn't like, here's a string of numbers and letters. That's your car model.
Yeah. We go through phases in our society where this stuff happens. And I actually feel like right now, if you look at the companies that are kind of evolving, they're kind of reverting back a little bit. So we went through this phase of like everyone wanted a catchy name, and now it almost feels like they're getting a little more technical again. Like you look at the AI companies or the crypto companies, they're having these weird names that like nobody can remember. They're like, what was the name of that company? It's like Kraken 123. You know, it's like,
You mean like Quibi?
like, yeah, all these things, Quibi, Kraken, all it's like people are not remembering necessarily those. And so I think we're probably going to go through another phase in a couple of years where people start to have more relevant names that are a little bit simpler to say again. Because I think when we get into innovative technology that's super, super technical, we tend to turn on our technical brain and then come up with technical names when it should actually be the opposite.
Yeah.
Right.
So speaking of that, I just want to say a quick thing about portmanteaus, especially when it comes to coming up with names that are easy to say. It's pretty popular because you've had success with Snapchat and Microsoft and Facebook and, well, Facebook, it is a portmanteau, or YouTube, right? Those are easy to say and they're short, but you can easily end up putting together two names that are longer that end up being difficult to say. So if you're going to do a portmanteau, and make sure that it's not going to turn into like this 5-syllable monstrosity of a name. It's going to keep it short and simple. Portmanteaus, I feel like, are a little bit kind of old hat at this point. Even like Instagram feels a little bit long and cumbersome to me, just a little bit.
Yeah.
But there's still a reasonable way to go because you're going to tend to find that they're available. Just be careful about how long they are.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, length is a major issue. People coming out with really long names, I just don't like it. It just doesn't work, and everyone shortens it on their own, and that's just a sign right there. One of the things also too is we do an innuendo check. So it may be an unintentional innuendo, but you don't want your product or company to turn into a joke unless you basically are a comedian or that's kind of your whole purpose, right? So like great example is Netflix did a nice job with this. They started a division called Netflix is a Joke. And everyone thought like, oh no, there's a YouTube page called Netflix is a Joke. They're going to be making fun of Netflix. And then you go on there and it's all the comedians, right? So things like that play well. But if you call your company something like the restaurant not too far from my house called Morning Wood, it is so it's really interesting. It is a kind of fancy breakfast place, quite expensive actually, and everybody loves the food. And they named the company Morning Wood. And people talk about it, but then they also cringe from it because when they take their kids there, the kids are like, what does that mean? And then there's like a sexual innuendo there. And it just, I don't know, it seems kind of weird to me.
Yeah.
Maybe it's working for them, but like I wouldn't do that personally.
It's so one of them that sticks out for me in this one is Virgin. I have no
Oh,
idea how they
yeah.
got the name Virgin. It's like has a sexual connotation. I don't know where it came from. I always thought it was weird.
Yeah, me too.
They've done okay on the strength of their services and kind of the marketing, but like it was, I think it was kind of a rough name.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then the very last thing on here is what I mentioned before. You can have these great ideas, these great names, but if there's no website and there's no way to legally own the name, you're going to have to move on. And I can't tell you to look up the name first, then come up with the name or vice versa. It's going to be painful either way
Yeah.
because if you find the greatest name ever and then it's completely bound legally to another company, it's really hard to find a way out of that. Especially with the URLs and the domain names. I mean, you can open up the same company name in a different county or a different state, as long as you can prove that you're offering something completely different than them. But then if they own the website, then it's going to be weird because their traffic is not going to. Basically, the search engine optimization and all that kind of stuff is geared towards that company's website rather than yours. And so you're going
Hmm.
to have to kind of fight for relevancy there. So this is just a painful process that everyone has to go through, and you just know that it's going to be challenging.
Yep.
And so let's talk about the very last thing, which before we talk about what we think are the best and worst names out there. And this is test. So this is controversial. People have told me that I'm completely wrong, and I would disagree with them. So they say the people who tell me I am wrong say that there's no need to test your names. That customers
They're
don't
they're
know.
categorically wrong.
They're categorically wrong. And here's why. They tell me the reason why you don't need to test your names is your customers don't know what they want or need. And it is your job as the leader of the company to figure out what you want to name your company. I agree with the fact that your customer's not usually going to come up with the name of your company. Now, like for like Team Coco and stuff, that kind of worked out in its weird and fun way. But
Hmm.
for the most part, I don't see ever in the 20 years I've been doing this, it's the customer came up with the name and then we took the name and ran with it. What testing actually does is it tells you what they don't like. So if
Yes.
you come up with, hey, we have 3 names for my restaurant and one of them is Morning Wood, they might say, hey, that one is provocative and makes me laugh, but I don't really like it because I want to take my kids to your restaurant, right? And
Yeah.
that's fair, totally fair. I don't have nothing wrong with the name Morning Wood if that works for them. But for your customer, you have to listen to them, and if they're telling you it makes you uncomfortable or makes them uncomfortable, then you should take that into consideration. You don't have to do exactly what they say, but you should take it into consideration. And this is why I think testing is important.
So the thing about testing is, it is ultimately up to that company, that leadership, or whoever else, the design team, the engineering, whoever is coming up with the name, marketing. It's ultimately up to them to come up with the name. Now, the main reason why you're doing testing is because you've been working hard at this very difficult, painful process for quite some time, and you are not objective anymore, and you kind of just want this to be over with. So you're going to probably have the non-objective lens on when you're evaluating your name, and you need to do a real gut check to make sure that you're not just trying to make this painful process be over with.
Yeah.
And
And I'll
you
tell you
gotta
one other thing too is like when we think back of that client that had come up with that product name and it was kind of like, just a weird mesh of words that they were using because they
Yep.
thought it'd be fun. And then they went and checked it overseas and apparently in Singapore it's like super offensive.
Yeah.
So and they didn't know, right? So if you didn't
Yeah.
user test this, you wouldn't know and you'd be like offending this whole group of people.
Yeah. It could be a massive group that you intended to be your prime audience. And this happens sometimes, especially because there are people from other countries, India, China, Russia, Europe, who want to bring a product to the United States, but maybe their product means something in a slang term in the US that they didn't anticipate, that's going to put them in a difficult position.
Absolutely. Well, hey, let's talk about the best and worst names, right?
All right.
Names
This
that
is
we
the
really
payoff.
liked. This is the payoff, right?
Yeah.
I'll go first since I don't know why, but maybe I'll just go with it. But so I'm gonna go with my best name. So there's actually quite a few names that I really like, but there's one that's always stuck with me, and it's a company called Mountain Hardware. And the reason why I like it is it was a spin-off. A bunch of engineers left North Face, the company that
Mhm.
sells gear for like backpacking and outdoors, and they created their new company called Mountain Hardware. Here's why I like it. It tells you it's about being in the mountains, and it's hardware that you take to the mountains. It sounds cool, it flows well, it makes total sense, and I've never forgot it. Now, another one of those competitors was Arc'teryx, and they make phenomenal gear, but I can't
Mhm.
spell that name for the life of me. Um,
It's kind of hard to say.
yeah, and it's kind of hard to say. And then a friend of ours who is an archaeologist major said, "Oh, it's from the Archaeoptic or Archaeopteryx, or it's a type of
It's harder to
dinosaur."
say.
Yeah, even harder to say, like a dinosaur, right? And I was like, okay, so they're trying to come up with something cool, but it's like hard to spell. It's really challenging, but they make
Yeah.
amazing product. So Mountain Hardware has been one of my favorite ones, and I know it's a little bit of a longer name, but it's so
Mhm.
clear. It's hardware for the mountains.
Yeah, so I was going to say it is a little bit of a longer name, and to some extent, North Face is a better name as far as just getting it out and saying it,
Uh huh.
and it's it speaks to being in the mountains or being on the side of a cliff or something like that. But what I like about the Mountain Hardware name, and I have some Mountain Hardware products, and they're great. Um, the term hardware just communicates something solid, something reliable,
Yep.
and even though it's a longer name, it's pretty rare that you're gonna find something that hits on all of the criteria. You're probably gonna have to compromise somewhere.
Yeah.
But the idea is not to compromise in multiple categories and just like maybe just one, right? But Mountain
Absolutely.
Hardware just communicates that feel so well.
Yeah, and actually, even though it's a longer name, it feels brief because
Yeah,
it's just Mountain Hardware. It's just hardware
because they're
for mountains.
familiar words,
Yeah,
I think.
familiar words, absolutely. And as you guys guessed, the worst one for me is Morningwood, and nothing against their restaurant or anything like that. I hear it is phenomenal food, and everybody loves to go. The only reason is because I don't like sexual names. I think that it just cuts out so many people and makes them uncomfortable that I'm like, is it really worth it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're OnlyFans, which ironically doesn't have a sexual name,
Nope.
then go with the sexual name because that's what your product is. Then it's evocative of what you're doing. If you're not doing something sexual, probably stay away from it. You
Yeah.
can maybe get away with it if you're like next to a university and you're catering to college students or something like that, or like maybe if you're a bar and you're just serving alcohol or something like that. But if you're not doing something sexual and you're not catering exclusively to adults, probably about a good idea to stay away
Yeah,
from
I
sexually
would
oriented
agree, and
names.
even to your point about OnlyFans, I feel like not only sexual stuff is on OnlyFans, and so the fact is they picked a name that doesn't link to sexual stuff that they can expand way beyond just that.
True,
You know what I mean?
but they probably can't. Just
Yeah.
from a practical standpoint, they tried. I think they're just try to be more like Patreon, but Patreon already exists, so I think they're kind of stuck.
It's true, and things like Patreon and that kind of stuff are used by makers and everybody just as a kind of a financing platform, right? For ideas and stuff like that, where OnlyFans got kind of locked in with, the sexual stuff. But so, what about you,
Yeah.
D? What was your best and worst?
So, not surprisingly, it took me just like naming itself. I had a harder time coming up with my favorite name
Uh huh.
than my least favorite name because it's easier to come up with a terrible name. But my best was Lyft.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because A, it's short. It's one syllable, comes right out. Number two, it is something that is in the lexicon. It's very memorable. It's like, and it's something that you used for that. So it's evocative, like, oh, give me a lift, right?
Yep.
So that became a company name that is associated with ride sharing. It's short. Uh, there's no weird innuendo or alternate meanings unless you're pushing really hard for it. I think that it's probably the best name that I can think of.
Yeah, it's clean, super clean, and even though they spell it differently, it's like easy to remember for some reason.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that one definitely hit. I like that one a lot as well, and I've always felt that way as well.
All right, so for my worst, I'm gonna go over a few honorable mentions first because like it was hard to narrow down, but like Quibi, I still have no idea what a Quibi is, and now I often forget it, and I usually end up in conversations with it's like that one weird streaming service that went away in 2 weeks. So that I think it's a terrible name because it's short and it's easy to say, but it's also weird and doesn't mean anything.
Well, I think it did. I think they were trying to. I think I heard on a podcast they were trying to do quick bites.
Yeah, this is one of the things where I'm like, be careful with your portmanteaus because like they don't mean they might not mean to other people what they means to you.
Exactly right, but I think it was like quick bites, like quick pieces of content, Quibi, and it didn't really connect.
Yeah, it's bad. Nvidia, I think is a bad name. Great company, other than some of their pricing strategy like is an issue, but they have great products, I'll say. But the name, I'm like, it's hard to say. It's weird to remember how to spell it, and they're right down the street from me too, so I see it all the time. And it doesn't seem to mean anything to me. Like I can see how vid is involved with video processing, but like it just kind of edges it. I don't think it's a great name. The other one I'll mention as an honorable mention is Apple TV Plus. Just because I'm like, really, you need to have TV and Plus, Apple TV, because you can't just call it TV Plus, and you can't just call it Apple TV because that's something else apparently. So it ends up being like this monstrosity of too many phrases hashed together until they can get it to work.
Yeah. What would you say is the ultimate worst though?
The worst one, and I had this reaction the first time I heard it. I was just like, what are you even doing? Is Peacock. So this fails on so many levels. It's too long. It feels uncomfortable to say. Even me saying that out loud, I'm just like, ugh. It says nothing about what it is. And of course it comes, I think it's NBC, right? It's either
Yeah.
NBC or CBS. I can't remember because those two names are both like meaningless strings of letters also.
Yeah.
I know that they're mean for something, but even what those letters stand for, like Columbia Broadcasting System and National Broadcasting System, it's just way too generic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I understand why they did it though, because their symbol,
it's their logo.
Yeah, their logo is the peacock, right? So you're like, oh, well, we should call it peacock.
Yeah, it's suggestive, and it's not supposed to be. It's it's supposed to include like a bunch of kids programming on there.
Yeah,
like it's wrong on almost every level, and it almost gets back to the like it like the mood is weird. It's like a bird walking around. Like, don't name a service after a logo, right? Come up with a logo that fits your name, not the other way around. Like that's I think is the takeaway from that.
Well, everyone, we thought this would be fun and informative because we can kind of get into our process and you can kind of learn specifically about how we think and how we do this and kind of what our steps were. I would love to hear from you as listeners if you have ideas on how you go about coming up with names. So if you can go to our YouTube page and leave comments on the actual YouTube version of the podcast and let us know, like, what did you do? Like, how did you come up with your name? What are some of the worst names that you've heard? We would love to hear from you. But thanks everyone so much for taking the time to listen to us today. We really appreciate it. Please, follow us, subscribe, all the things we mention every week. We're trying to grow the podcast beyond just the tech community and letting other people know that, it doesn't matter if you're a tech company or you make cars or you make farm equipment. Testing, research, and understanding what your users' needs are important. And we'd love to be able to share everything we've learned over the last 20 years with you. So thanks, everyone. And we will see you all next week.